Good morning, friends, and welcome to another week together with Pastor's Ponderings. It has been wonderful to walk through each of these past weeks with you so far, and I'm excited for the upcoming weeks that lie ahead of us now. In these past months, the world has seemed turned somewhat upside down with the whole COVID-19 crisis, and we've had to make a lot of modifications and accommodations for the sake of loving our neighbor well and keeping each other safe throughout this time. One of the big changes that we've made is that for a while we weren't able to gather in person, and even now that we're able to gather back together in person, things have been drastically modified. But it's wonderful that we're able to be together in this time, and yet we still find ourselves yearning for the day when this virus is behind us and when we can return to the fullness of our worship together as a Christian people. And so as we think about that fullness of worship that we yearn for, it seemed fitting to spend these next few weeks looking at the parts of the Lutheran liturgy. What are some of those components that we're enjoying now? What are some of the ones that we can't wait to have return? And why are they so meaningful and significant, not just for us as Lutherans, but how have they enriched and blessed the Christian faith throughout the ages? Even though over these next few weeks we're going to be spending time talking about our Lutheran liturgy and the components of it, many of these pieces can connect with the Christian faith and worship throughout the ages. They've often been tweaked a little bit. Sometimes they've been shifted around to different places in the liturgy. But much of what we do as we gather together and worship, these are practices that we share with Christians from 1500 and even longer years ago in many cases. But today we're going to pause and we're going to take some time and we're going to talk about the Invocation. The part at the very beginning of our Lutheran liturgy where we welcome everybody and we say that we are gathered together in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. The Invocation seems like such a small and quick part of the liturgy that we often pass it by without a thought, but it actually has incredible significance for how we start off in our time of worship together. When we say that we gather in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one of the things that we're doing is we're identifying the God that we worship. We live in a world that's full of all sorts of different things. You can't even count how many different things that people have found to give their worship to. And so as we gather for a Christian liturgy, we're going to be very specific that we worship the Christian God, the triune God, the God who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. No other deity receives our worship as we gather in this place, and the Invocation makes that clear. Additionally, we know that knowing someone's name gives you a certain power. And so if you know my name, you can say, "Hey, Pastor David," and even in a crowded room, I'm going to hear my name, and that's going to call my attention to you. And so it's actually an incredible blessing that God allows us to invoke his name. And so the fact that we can invoke the name of the triune God shows the blessing that God has given to us and the love that he has for us, but it also allows us to call on his blessing as we gather in this place. Not only is the Invocation recognizing that we worship the triune God, but it's also an invitation of the blessing of our God upon us as we move into worship together. So it's a time of clarity, saying who we are. It's also a time of blessing as we recognize that this God that we worship, he is also among us, directing the worship that we have and blessing us in everything that follows. You've probably noticed that as the pastor gets up in front of the congregation to share the Invocation, in addition to the words Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they also tend to make the sign of the cross. We gather in the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Additionally, if you've looked to the left or the right of you, you've probably noticed that many of your neighbors, as they hear the name of the triune God, they just automatically make the sign of the cross upon themselves. So as we hear in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, many of us will cross ourselves as we hear those words. It's just almost an automatic and reflexive response for many Christians. These practices connect us way back to Christians in the early church in a beautiful way. And so one reason for participating in these motions together is that they're practices that connect us with devotional life of Christians really throughout the entire history of the church. And it's a beautiful thing to know that we're a part of such a great and long line of Christian witness. But additionally, as we speak the name of the triune God and we make the sign of the cross, we remember really the whole story of our faith all packaged into one. We remember the God that we worship, and we remember that that triune God is the same God who went to the cross on our behalf to work out salvation for us. As we make the sign of the cross on ourselves, we remember that we belong to the God who went to the cross on our behalf. And even we may find ourselves being brought all the way back to our time of baptism, where when the pastor held us as a little child or whenever we were baptized, they took the oil picks and with their thumb they traced the sign of the cross on our forehead. And with that cross we were sealed with the sign of Christ for our entire lives. And so, as we hear the invocation, we see the sign of the cross made by the pastor. We cross ourselves with that same sign. We remember the baptism that brought us into the family of God, that made us a child of God, and that gave us all of the benefits of the work of Christ, who came, walked among us, lived, died, and rose again for our behalf. And so that invocation that we talked about today, it seems so simple, and yet it ultimately encompasses everything that is going to follow in our worship. It speaks to who we are as a people. It identifies the God that we worship. It invites his incredible blessing upon us as we worship, and it reminds us of the wonderful and saving works that that very God has done so generously on our behalf. And so I'm excited for the following weeks as we'll talk about more of the components of the Lutheran liturgy and the incredible significance that they have. And I can't wait to work with Pastor Short to talk about each and every one of them and the incredible blessing that they hold. God bless you, dear friends, and I'll see you in the weeks ahead.